Здравствуйте.
Hello. The situation in the oil products market is deviating from traditional parameters and is significantly more problematic than in previous years. Today, we are discussing the factors affecting the market with Maksim Dyachenko, managing partner of the company, Proleum. Hello, Maksim. Maksim, it would probably not be an exaggeration to say that in recent months the market has been experiencing a tense balance of supply and demand. In your opinion, is there a shortage of different types of petrol, and what has been the recent trend in the balance of major oil products? Hello. Thank you for inviting me. You know, this is our second meeting, and it seems we always meet when the market situation is quite challenging. Yes, we should make it a tradition. I hope we meet less often. Although, of course, I find you a pleasant conversationalist. You know, I recently looked up the meaning of the word shortage, as it is often mentioned. In principle, a shortage does not mean the complete absence of something, but a lack, when demand for certain goods exceeds supply. In this regard, we definitely have a shortage of petrol and even diesel fuel at the moment. It manifests differently in various regions, but even in the Moscow region, where everything is well supplied and there are no problems at petrol stations, you cannot easily buy fuel. It is all allocated. And you know, the main indicator of a shortage is the price. Fortunately, we have had an exchange trading system for over 10 years now, which is representative and transparent. In fact, the frenzied demand in trading, daily growth, and record price updates indicate that there are enough offers. About 30% of petrol production is sold on the exchange, although in August it was even up to 50% on certain days. And all the remaining goods are sold in small wholesale. In small wholesale, when there is not enough product, all buyers immediately rush to the exchange trading, and the price skyrockets. So the exchange is the ultimate litmus test. When fuel supply issues begin, the number of participants buying sharply increases, demand is activated, the number of purchase applications increases, and they far exceed the supply applications. What the regulators do next is a separate issue, but it is clear that we now have a serious shortage of petrol and some signs of a diesel fuel shortage. Among experts, it is widely believed that under normal conditions, petrol production exceeds domestic market needs by 15 to 20%. If we start from this thesis, which I think can be interpreted variably, what is the reason for the current shortage? Does it mean a comparable reduction in production? Or are there still some additional factors affecting the imbalance that has arisen this year? Well, first of all, the main fundamental factor is the imbalance of supply and demand. That is, not enough fuel is being produced now, and more is being consumed. The increase in demand is a complex issue. There are different statistics, and we also rely on the statistics published by SBER. They publish the spending on fuel by their clients using cards, and it turns out that year-on-year spending is roughly at the same level. Taking into account a 10% price increase, we have a 10% decrease in sales, so there is no such growth in demand that would be unpredictable. There is no economic growth that manufacturers have not predicted, so the problem is not there. Obviously, the key issue is the scheduled maintenance, which we kept postponing, because first we have spring, we need to build up reserves for the summer period, then we have the summer period itself, when these reserves need to be used, but the main thing is not to stop the factories. All this was postponed to autumn, and now it turns out that in August, September, and already October, record volumes of capacities are going into scheduled maintenance. This is about 3.5 million tons of total oil refining. And now the second point. These were such historical values. With such volumes, we are forming a deficit. The actual domestic demand exceeds the supply of petrol by about 100,000 tons per month. A deficit of 100,000 tons per month with reserves of 2 million tons, which we had at the beginning of August, is a figure that, yes, even such a deficit traditionally always had a significant impact on trading, prices increased. And after that, well, the exact figure is unknown. If we talk about 15%, that's another 3 million tons. So what did we lose then? Well, if we take our surplus months, January to February, the maximum historical export of petrol was about 700,000 tons. Of course, now consumption is more than 700,000 tons per month, yes. Of petrol, only export. Accordingly, let's imagine that the difference is somewhere around 200 to 300,000 tons. This is domestic consumption, and, accordingly, we are currently short of about 400,000. It seems that such a volume of production has fallen due to so-called unscheduled shutdowns. Maxim, if we talk about the loss of capacity due to scheduled and unscheduled maintenance, which leads to this supply deficit situation, doesn't it raise the question of the need to adjust the maintenance schedule for September, at least in the planned part, to somehow give more rhythm to the supply?
Так сказать, как бы в плановой части для того, чтобы хоть каким-то образом большую ритмичность предложению придать.
You know, unfortunately, there are no miracles. We have 18 large oil refineries, and in total, I think, about 30 oil refineries, which are also important. 6 months when repairs can be done simply due to weather conditions. Well, you can't do installation work, construction work at sub-zero temperatures, which is exactly commissioning work, which is carried out at the oil refineries. In most of our cities where these refineries are located, simply cannot be done. We have a very short period for these repairs. If repairs are not done, there can simply be accidents, technological disasters, so this cannot be done either, and, accordingly, every year this problem is tried to be solved. But it's like in Proleum's fable, no matter how you sit, nothing will change. Yes, the same story.
Ничего не поменяется, да, одна и та же история.
Now the problem is not in the scheduled repairs. Yes, it was supposed to be solved somehow this year, and of course, no one predicted such a situation. And the situation with these unscheduled shutdowns, related to arrivals, attacks on the oil refineries, it is impossible to predict. This is a situation of pure force majeure. Accordingly, it has now become obvious that our system does not provide for such force majeure situations in such quantities, and in some sense, is not ready for it.
К ней, в некотором смысле не готова, да, хотя я думаю, что...
Although I think, you know, there is no system in the world ready for such challenges, when there is simultaneous sanction pressure, serious restrictions, and on top of that, all this, yes, well, no one would cope. But in this regard, such a question arises, in connection with this recurrence of the problem of unscheduled repairs due to increasing attacks, is there a need to create protective structures for the refineries as some element of this unscheduled repair? As a matter of fact, so to speak, the situation simply suggests itself, because today everything is resolved at the expense of insurers, as far as I understand, at the expense of the oil companies themselves. Is there not, perhaps, a need for the state to somehow get involved in the creation of such measures? Such, well, as far as I know, these funds are operational, the entire infrastructure is protected. It's just that the intensity of these strikes, attacks, has increased significantly. You know, I'm not a military expert. It's probably difficult for me to speculate, but I can say for sure that all the responsible bodies and enterprises themselves, and the security companies, and the relevant ministry, they definitely know what they're doing. They are doing the job. I recently had a conversation with a colleague. He asked something similar to your question, only from a different angle, not about creating some kind of shield that would protect everything. He says, why not? He says, another installation, let it be in reserve. And VT says, well, in case of anything, I just set everything up for them. Well, yes, there's $1 billion, in principle, yes, and there are no problems. As a remark, what would I like to say? How does Ukraine solve this problem? It also has very significant destruction. So, quite recently, one of the leaders of the Ministry of Energy level made a statement that due to, so to speak, constant destruction, it is impossible to carry out unscheduled repairs because they are expensive, they cost money that Ukraine receives from foreign sources, and then there is repeated destruction.
Украина получает из зарубежных источников, и тут же как бы идет повторное разрушение. Единственное, так сказать,
The only
вариант,
option is the
защиты,
protective contours that
которые
they're
будут
installing today at
противостоять
all
всем
substations as
маркетным
such.
как таковых. Максим,
Maxim,
почему
why
бы
not address this issue if
не
this risk
озадачиться
becomes
таким
constant?
вопросом, если этот риск становится постоянным?
Ну, очевидно, что
Well, obviously,
это
it's just
дорого
expensive.
просто. Любое
Any
хозяйство
economic
практически
entity
состоит в
independently. It's
сложном
difficult
режиме,
for them to
когда
solve
такой
such a
задачи
task because the contour is already heavy class
вооружения
armament.
такого тяжелого класса уже,
Various
и
classes of
много
armament will be
различных классов
required.
вооружения потребуется.
The example you
Для
gave with
этого,
Ukraine only
разумеется,
formed after
и
understanding that the costs of not forming such a contour are significantly higher.
понимание того, что затраты на неформирование
Да.
такого контура, они существенно выше, да, когда
When
эти работы
iterations
повторяются
repeat
и
and repeat,
повторяются,
repair
то
work simply
работы
cannot be carried out. There are
существенно
neither spare
повторяются,
parts in
нет
such
запасных
quantities,
частей,
and the
и
restoration
сроки
periods are
восстановления
very
очень
long.
длительные, да, и получается,
And it
что
turns out that
и
those
возможно
gigantic
инвестиции
investments in
в
the
защитный
protective
контур, они
contour become
становятся
justified and
в разы
profitable.
и рентабельны. У нас пока до
We
такой
haven't
степени не
reached that point
дошло,
yet,
хотя,
obviously,
точнее,
although,
как-то
more
когда
precisely, perhaps not quite.
уровень затрат уже, наверное, такой, который
The
требует
level of costs is probably already such that it really requires changes in approaches to the defense system, to significant infrastructure. When this is implemented, it is obvious that in the near future this issue will be raised. I've already heard that this discussion is already taking place at the legislative level. Such questions are being raised, because, of course, the cost of petroleum products is primarily a pressing social issue. I literally looked at the central bank statistics yesterday or the day before yesterday on this basket, by which they measure inflation, and there, the cost of petroleum products rose by 22.8% from August to July. That is, all inflation there. Deflation is happening, yes, but petroleum products are sharply surging. In my opinion, petroleum products and communication means, that's all together with post, deliveries and so on, not just phones. Therefore, it is obvious that now the focus should shift to ensuring serious protection.
Серьезную защиту.
В условиях нехватки собственного производства рынок балансируется во многим
In conditions of a lack of domestic production, the market is largely balanced by imports from Belarusian plants. In general, how do you see this situation in terms of duration, and is there not a danger of some disruptions from the Belarusian side, for example, in the supply of sufficient volumes of Belarusian petroleum products to the Russian market?
белорусских нефтепродуктов на российский рынок?
Ну, во-первых, они дорогие.
Well, firstly, they're expensive, because they're, after all, how to say it correctly, colleagues are primarily guided by commercial feasibility.
Ориентируются в первую очередь
На прибыль,
на
на
коммерческую целесообразность.
Yes, they have their own state tasks. It's a state company, and as I understand it, they can't help but trade at the quoted price, right? And it turns out, we have this unresolved issue, although the media writes that a decision has been made to increase the damper, but so far I haven't seen any orders or any protocol, not even a meeting where it's stated that this decision has been made.
Какого-то протокола, даже совещания, в котором прописано, что это решение принято.
Yes, instructions have been given.
Профильные ведомства говорят, что
The relevant departments say that yes, we are not against it, but only if budgetary procedures are followed or if the budget allows. And everyone knows that we currently have a very serious budget deficit, and it seems the budget does not. What this means is not very clear. If the damper is not paid, accordingly, the Belarusians will have to raise it even more significantly. Already, as far as I've heard, some significant premiums are not being supplied to our domestic market. They will have to raise this price even further. We, in principle, that is, in principle, import is not so profitable, yes, from this point of view. Simply put, it's unprofitable, yes, given the prices that have formed in our domestic market, import is not a viable solution. We have additional reserves internally. We have many mini refineries that can produce class 4, class 3 fuel. You know, our approach now, the situation is force majeure, and although they acknowledge it, yes, in reality, we purchase fuel from the affected plants, and we receive a notification of the onset of force majeure. Nothing suspends the supplier's obligations under the concluded deals. That is, we are not being shipped goods, nothing happens with it while the force majeure situation persists. Well, until the refineries are repaired, we somehow regulate this. And from a regulatory point of view, it's as if force majeure is not happening, and we want to impose these very difficult conditions for the industry on some normal economic activity, which is basically impossible. That is, the entire budget needs to be changed immediately, something else needs to be done. In my opinion, this is wrong. Specific targeted measures need to be taken for 2 months. For example, allow the sale of fourth-class petrol for 2 months. process it at mini refineries. We have a huge amount of stable gas petrol, naphtha, yes, we continue to export it now in large quantities, that is, to find some such new solutions. You know, at oil depots, you can actually mix fuel, but this is not done because now all stable gas petrol is subject to excise duty. Accordingly, we will have to pay excise duty twice. Yes, it's impossible, that is, if the situation is really difficult, then we definitely have a large reserve stock. It is known that recently the government has been taking a number of measures to stabilize the situation. You mentioned some of them. This includes the ban on petrol exports and the introduced ban on diesel exports. And this latest decision, which many are writing about today, here's an article in the Russian newspaper just now about adjusting the calculated value of the damper. Here's the question. Let's assume that all this really happened. There is a decision to deviate from the exchange quotations for the payment of the damper, so it's like everything. What do you think, Maxim? How effective are these measures? How quickly will these measures yield any result in stabilizing the situation while maintaining the current level of force majeure? When can we talk about it? Well, it should be understood that increasing the cutoff price for the damper is a measure that does not stabilize the market, but will allow maintaining production volumes under the current difficult conditions. In the domestic market, yes, and supplies to the domestic market, but this is an inflationary measure, as the central bank says, meaning the price could rise significantly above the wholesale level. Already now, with the current wholesale prices, which, by the way, are being restrained in exchange trading, you haven't mentioned another measure, yes, that we have. An artificial restriction in exchange trading, the price cannot rise by more than 30 rubles a day. Although, in reality, with actual demand, it would have already increased by, I don't know, 10,000, because the same product with delivery in a month costs 70,000 rubles, and if you go to buy it now, it costs 90,000 rubles. This is a classic shortage situation, where if you want a low price, it's like some virtual product at some point. But if you really need the product, yes, it's very scarce and very expensive. And, in fact, raising these cutoff zones will only lead to an increase in wholesale prices. And we immediately face the problem of retail prices, because all independent retailers are already operating at a loss, somewhere around 5 to 6 rubles per liter in the negative. They are forced to raise prices, they are losing sales volume. What's happening? All customers are going to Ving petrol stations. Ving cannot double its sales volume. Logistically, technically, there are thousands of these, and there's not enough fuel either. And, in fact, it's like a spiral. So, to take and raise prices at petrol stations by 6 rubles for the whole country, I think such a measure is unlikely to be adopted. This measure you mentioned, about raising the damper, in my opinion, cannot be adopted by changing the legislation directly and setting it for a long time ahead, because it will bring such prolonged problems, difficult to solve.
Потому что она будет нести такие пролонгированные проблемы, сложно решаемый вопрос розничной цены на...
This is a question of the retail price for SS and the survival of independent retailers. It destabilizes the market. Accordingly, it needs to be adopted for 2 months retrospectively. Now, upon departure, you should even remove this question of these levels. Pay the damper, which is in the budget, in principle, for August, and for September, and for October. Let them calmly restore. They need this money to restore the plants now. Let them calmly restore and work. But for all other market participants, let these levels remain such that ensure a normal level of functioning, because now the chain starts. Banks, creditors, traders look at how the petrol stations will survive with losses, what trend, what future for the petrol stations, and if wholesale prices are raised, and retail is unlikely to increase, yes, and here a whole chain of negative events can develop, which we don't want to develop like this. It's clear, but this situation of imbalance arises, yes, when independent companies cannot buy petrol in exchange trading because VINGs hold back the offer for their network first and foremost. From the report, I want to understand this point. And what will happen in this regard with the independent network if the upper limit is restricted there? Will it just stop working? Or will it be absorbed? What's your view here? Right now, networks are already stopping. That is, there are such networks whose stock is exhausted. New shipments are not coming to them. They are not being supplied with goods in small wholesale. In fact, it's not even a question of price, but that they are starting. Well, you know, they are not completely stopped. If you look visually, cars are being refueled there. primarily limits retail sales to customers because they have long-term contracts with various municipal bodies, transport enterprises. They are obliged to supply them. Well, they limit what they can. They raise prices for everyone.
Ну, вот они то, что могут ограничить, для всех повышают цены. В дальнейшем, знаете,
In the future, the question is still what Our company actively provides trade credits. Our financial unit monitors the petrol station network. They are, in principle, quite well capitalized. That is, over the last 2 to 3 years, when there were periods of good profitability, many, though not all, have created a financial cushion, a reserve that allows them to endure several months of such loss-making activities. Then, of course, it is very important for the government to find a new balance of some sort. Either allow retail prices to rise considering industrial inflation and these existing costs, or establish new levels of the damper that will allow for profitability. Historically, this has always been the case. As soon as retail reaches such a difficult situation as now, it can operate for 2 to 4 months, after which the government would take action, never abandoning it. Everyone understands that this is a very important segment, that there are many cities, districts, and remote villages where, in principle, there are no large vertically integrated companies, and accordingly, this is an important element that can seriously destabilize the market. At the same time, in such a situation, many entrepreneurs are leaving the business. They are indeed selling their petrol station networks, those who are heavily in debt, those who invest, including Vincom, of course. Yes. And still, if we talk about forecasts for stabilizing the situation, the restriction of exports, especially diesel being the main product, there has always been a significant surplus of it in the domestic market. Still, when do you think the price situation might stabilize? If the force majeure level remains roughly, the force majeure factor remains roughly at the same level. With the current market structure, there will be no stabilization. We need to somehow make additional decisions that will allow us to differentiate processing, connect mini refineries, connect blending at oil depots, somehow change environmental standards, from which, of course, the end consumer will suffer. Perhaps switch to a propane-butane mixture from associated gas, because we have, by the way, a large surplus of propane-butane mixture. Exactly, after the export stopped, after Europe banned, so to speak, all these things, all this opportunity not to burn associated gas, as is happening today, but to process it. Here we also have no such maneuver, because the infrastructure was developed for a certain, I think, 15% of car owners switch to liquefied automotive gas, its price will already be higher than petrol. Filling stations are all very small in size. 1,000 to 1,500 tons is already a large filling station, and oil depots, they have 20, 30, 100,000 tons. That is, there is no infrastructure for storage. And not every petrol station has a gas filling station either. It turns out that when demand suddenly increases, and the infrastructure is not ready to meet it, there will be an inevitable imbalance in the opposite direction, a price increase. It will, of course, then stabilize due to the development of supply and somehow level out. Therefore, here, I am an optimist. I hope that this situation of half measures will not continue indefinitely. Either they will make some reliable protection that will allow the plants to function normally, or the issue will be resolved in some other way. Yes, our country's leadership regularly speaks out for resolving the conflict diplomatically.
Руководство страны регулярно высказывается за решение конфликта дипломатическим образом. Мне кажется, что все-таки подключать переработку.
It seems to me that still connecting some processing and temporarily lowering the class to the fourth so that it would be possible at mini refineries, using that straight-run gasoline BGS produced by large plants, to make a large volume of petrol that will meet all the needs of our entire country, is quite simple. And, in principle, a solvable task. In connection with the latest Western sanctions against the Russian Federation, against consumers of Russian oil, I mean the punitive duties against India, in connection with the lowering of the price cap on Russian grades, we see that there is some widening of the discount in the crude oil market. This means it is increasing in both spot deals and long-term contracts. How is this situation developing for oil products? These recent, so to speak, Western sanctions are affecting the price of their export.
Ожидаем.
Конечно, да.
Of course, yes, and the paradox is that while the global market is quite weak right now, meaning oil products are getting cheaper, in our country there is a shortage and prices are rising.
Дешевеют, а у нас в стране дефицит и цена дорожает.
This is explained by non-market factors, that is, the situation that has developed. If these geopolitical imbalances and unplanned stoppages were removed, it is quite likely that our market would now be oversupplied. There would be an excess of oil products, and at such prices, oil companies would find it very profitable to supply the domestic market.
И по таким ценам нефтяным компаниям очень выгодно поставлять.
Продавать на внутренний рынок.
Да, на внутренний
Yes,
рынок,
to the
конечно,
domestic
выгодно
market,
рынок,
of
если
course,
могли бы,
they would,
да,
if they could,
могли
try to
бы
flood this market with pleasure and earn quite a lot here.
довольно-таки много. Вот. И, ну, то, что вы справедливо
And,
сказали,
well,
да,
as you
сейчас,
rightly said,
наверное,
yes,
пример
now,
нефтяных
probably, an example with oil
компаний.
products. Literally, I read yesterday or the day before, tankers under sanctions with Russian LNG are unloading in the south of China, and there the discount is about 18 to 23%.
23%.
Мгм. Ну,
There is your answer.
Вот и ответ, да. То есть,
примерный индикатор,
да,
да?
Any
любые
sanctions
санкции,
lead to
они
their
как
circumvention and a deal where the discount becomes extremely attractive to the buyer.
и сделки, да, когда дисконт становится крайне интересным для
This is how they acted. Then gradually, as logistical and payment chains are established, these spreads narrow.
того, как выстраиваются там логистические цепочки, платежные цепочки, эти спреды сужаются. Ну, наверное,
Probably, since we have gone through it once, we can adapt again. The question is what the global prices will be.
мировые цены,
Хотелось бы, конечно, закончить
I would
именно
like, of course, to end on a positive note, as you said, that, in principle, the force majeure factor will not last so long, and the situation will be stabilized. Thank you very much for the informative conversation. Thank you.